Hello. We'll go ahead and get started at 3. Thanks everyone for who's joined so far. We're just waiting until 3 to get started. Are Adam McBride Smith, Melissa Hanks, and Christine Getman on the line?
I see
Hey.
2 out of the 3, Amy.
Who do you see?
I see Adam is on.
Okay.
I don't see Melissa Hanks yet,
Okay.
and I do see Christine.
Great. Thank you. All right, we are at time. We'll go ahead and start. Tiffany, can you admit folks?
Yep.
Okay, thank you so much. Okay, I'm going to get started with housekeeping. Hello and good afternoon on behalf of the Oregon Project Management Advisory Board. Welcome to our Project Management User Group presentation of the month. My name is Amy Croucher and I will be facilitating our meeting today. We'd like to start with a few housekeeping items. As you may have noticed, this meeting is being recorded. Please mute your phone or PC if not speaking to help reduce any background noise. If you're not speaking, you are encouraged to remain off camera. A link to the meeting resources will be shared shortly after today's session and posted on the DAS YouTube channel and OPMAB websites. If you have any questions, Adam and others will answer them at the end of the presentation. The PMUG planning team is also looking for a new member. Please contact me, Amy Croucher, if you're interested in participating. The Oregon Project Management Advisory Board is looking for a new member. Please go to the OPMA website in the chat to apply. Also, if you're interested in business analysis processes, the Business Analyst Networking Group meets during months in which PMUG does not meet. For more information, visit the Bang website posted in the chat. There are also Agile Community of Practice sessions occurring as well. I will provide you with the information as a follow-up email to this presentation. You're welcome to share with your colleagues and encouraged to spread the word on our PMUG Wednesday sessions. I'm pleased to host this session presented by Adam McBride-Smith, Melissa Hanks, and Christine Getman. Adam McBride-Smith has worked for the state for 4 years and is digital accessibility strategist with the Oregon Health Authority on the accessibility, inclusion, and education team. He is a certified professional in web accessibility and an accessible document specialist. Melissa Hanks is a policy analyst for the Oregon Health Authority with over 16 years of experience at ODHS OHA, improving public health and human services for communities across Oregon. Christine Getman has been supporting accessibility and disability health equity at the Oregon Health Authority for almost 4 years. She is currently the Accessibility, Inclusion, and Education Unit Manager in the Equity and Inclusion Division at Oregon Health Authority. Without further ado, please take it away, Adam.
Thank you, Amy. Can you hear me okay? All right.
I can, yes, thank you.
Okay, great. I am going to attempt to share screen, and then I'm gonna just have us all briefly that was a great introduction, but we'll briefly reintroduce ourselves. Let me first share screen. Okay, can you see my slides okay?
Yes, we can, thanks.
Great. All right. So thank you for the introduction. I think we might add to it with a few words, but yeah, welcome everybody, and we're happy to have a chance to present for you on the digital accessibility requirements under the ADA. I'll hand it over briefly to Christine.
Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. Good to be with you. As mentioned, my name is Christine Getman. I use she, her pronouns. Today, my long dark hair is styled down, wearing a black and white striped shirt, a headset, and my background is blurred, but you see hints of a home office and a bright window behind me. And Melissa, are you here to give a quick intro?
I am. Thank you, Christine.
Yay.
And this is a good opportunity to test my audio too, because it's been blinking in and out today. So hopefully everybody can hear me all right. Hi, everyone. I'm Melissa Hanks, she, her pronouns. I'm not on camera today for aforementioned technology issues, but my picture is a black and white picture of a smiling, nerdy white lady wearing black glasses and a t-shirt. I work in the Central Operations Office with Christine Kautz at the Oregon Health Authority, and I am very proud to be a certified project manager in the state of Oregon, and to be a certified public manager and also a contract administrator with the Oregon Health Authority. So we're very excited to be here to talk to you today about digital accessibility and all of those good things.
Great. Thanks to both of you. And once again, my name's Adam McBride-Smith. I use he, him pronouns. I'm digital accessibility strategist on the AIE team. That's Christine's team. And I'm a white guy. I've got short hair and a short salt and pepper beard, and I'm wearing a headset and glasses and a gray sweater. Okay, well, without further ado, let's introduce what we're going to talk about today. So, for the next hour or so, we're going to talk about what digital accessibility is and who needs it. We'll talk about some of the models and values that guide our work. We're going to touch on recent federal rules, as well as guidelines, and then our approach to these rules through policies. So that'll be kind of the first half, and then we're going to move over to the second half of the presentation where we'll touch on digital accessibility and project management, and we'll finish with an example which we're calling a tale of two COVID website projects. So with all that said, I will hand off to Christine again for the next section.
Thanks, Adam. This is Christine. So for some folks, you've heard about digital accessibility, you geek out on the technical details. And for others, maybe this is a newer concept. And I think it's something that is loosely defined and continuously refining the definition. So our working definition of digital accessibility is on the slide here, and we say digital accessibility is an approach to technology and content design that involves thinking specifically about the experiences and the needs of people with disabilities. By designing for these needs and by following the guidance and the leadership of people with disabilities, we arrive at technology that works better for everyone. And I got a little heart on the screen. Thank you. Next slide. Perfect. So there's a few ways in which we look at providing accessible content. And one is addressing who needs accessible content. And this is just a short list of all of the varying identities and intersectional identities, but folks who are blind or deafblind, someone who's experiencing low vision, people with color blindness, people who have motor disabilities. I identify as somebody with a motor disability. People with cognitive or learning disabilities, folks who are deaf or hard of hearing, people who speak English as a second language or don't speak English or have additional languages as well, and also folks who have a temporary or situational disability that could be due to positioning, due to injury, due to illness. Oops, there we go. Next slide, please. We keep flashing to your desktop.
I'm sorry about that. I'm having issues here.
No problem. And so with folks who intersect and need accessible content, there's oftentimes we utilize assistive technology or AT. So some common forms of AT that could be used to access digital content would be screen readers. You may have heard of programs like JAWS, NVDA, VoiceOver, or even narrator. And those read the content to the user. Whatever's on the screen, if it's tagged properly, it will read it out. There's other software, text-to-speech, like Read Aloud or Speechify, speech-to-text, so speaking into our devices to dictate or to navigate. A common one that you may have heard of is Dragon Naturally Speaking. There's magnification software, there's dark mode, other customizable palettes. I think all of us can pretty easily toggle onto dark mode if we need it. There's keyboard access, so that's using the keys to navigate content rather than like a mouse or the speech or the speech to text software. There's switch devices, so like a button with different cadences of holding the button down could help somebody toggle through content to click on a button. So there's different commands for a single button or multiple buttons, and we call that switch devices or switch users. And lastly here, but this is not everything, folks who use on-screen keyboards, I fall into that category. On-screen keyboards are a way to click using a mouse on buttons. It looks like a keyboard on your screen. You can also utilize things to support mobility disabilities, like a dwell function that would auto-click, so you don't need to press the mouse button, but it does it automatically for you. So you can see that there's a lot of different assistive technology that helps us interface with content. And the goal of digital accessibility is to make sure that our content is as accessible as possible. So all of these different forms of assistive tech can interface without extra accommodations. Next slide, please. So we named some specific folks, but there's a trick question here. Who benefits from digital accessibility? It's actually all of us. And who can uphold digital accessibility? I know you heard some credentials at the opening of this presentation, but the secret is we all have a role to play to uphold digital accessibility, digital content, and our work. So if you're here, there's something for you. Next slide. So another element that we wanted to invite and discuss are models of disability. And these are studies or lenses to view the way in which disability and we view the barriers that people with disabilities have. So it's a study of how disability interacts with medical fields, social culture, educational and government institutions, that's us, and the workforce. And the models of disability are sets of beliefs that help us understand and help explain the social attitudes and the actions that we witness towards disability. It could be things that we've seen or heard in the workplace, all the way to what we see in the media, in movies, and in the news and headlines. So this is just a way, a frame to view disability, and it helps us understand our work and how we create content. Next slide, please. And please interrupt me, Adam, if I'm going too quickly or if I'm skimming over things. So this is really interesting. And if this is your first time learning about the models of disability, it can feel overwhelming. But I promise you, over time, it actually is quite comforting to see this these different lenses. So here quickly, the medical model, if we're considering a person who is disabled, the medical model says the person needs fixing. They need a treatment. They need a cure. I often talk a lot about cure culture, big in the 80s and 90s, telethons. That leads us to the charity model. So this is saying the person who has a disability is a victim of this experience. It's tragic. The economic model views someone with a disability as someone who cannot produce, not as productive. It's even hard to say these things in a presentation like this, but this is how the economic model views it. The moral model is interesting, and I think, we've heard scenarios, especially in media, about someone deserving the disability. They must have done something to end up in this situation, right? The social model, now we're going a little more optimistic, it feels better. The social model says, no, you know what? Actually, society and the barriers that we have in place are the disabling factors. So it's not the person with the disability, it's the fact that they can't enter the building. It's the stairs, it's the narrow doorway, it's the flat PDF. That's actually the issue, it's society. And then lastly, the identity model says that the person with a disability, the disability that they are experiencing is unique and a part of all of their other identities and should be celebrated. Any questions, any feelings coming up Please feel free to take notes. We can also come back to this later. And next slide, please. So in our work, the most common models that we may interact with and just the way our programs are created would likely be the medical model and the social model, and especially so for those of us coming from the Oregon Health Authority. Anyone doing public health work, any human services, that's kind of the lens with this slide. So there's an image on the screen here of a person in a wheelchair encountering a flight of stairs. They're at the base of the stairs looking up to the flight of stairs, but there's a sign that says, "Way in, everyone welcome." Well, okay, maybe that's not true. So the medical model would say that this person with the disability is the issue. They need to change. We must treat their disability so they can walk up those stairs. We can find a cure so they can overcome and go up those stairs and enter the building. But the social model says, no, I don't agree with that. This is a physical environment issue. The stairs are the barrier, and that is what needs to change. So let's build a ramp. Let's put in an elevator. Let's create accessible documents. And so much of the content you'll hear today is framed under this social model lens. Next slide, please. Oh, and I think I'm passing to Adam to kind of lead us into more of the rules that are guiding the work that we're going to share today. Go ahead.
Yeah, thanks, Christine. So we wanted to move from there into a timeline of how things have played out over the last few years with policy at Oregon Health Authority and ODHS, and how that has interacted with the changing policy landscape at the federal level. So for starters, way back in November 2022, the Digital Accessibility Policy Work Group began meeting, and that was a shared effort between OHA, Oregon Health Authority, and ODHS, Oregon Department of Human Services. And the three of us were all involved in that effort. In the midst of our process, then, July of 2023, the DOJ, the Federal Department of Justice, released their Notice of Proposed Rulemaking on Accessibility of Web Information and Services of State and Local Government Entities. And that was a long-awaited next move in a process that had really been ongoing since 2010, when the DOJ first announced its intention to publish or to pursue this rulemaking path. Another thing that happened in that interim, this when we start to talk about WCAG or the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, this can get a little bit confused, but we'll try to straighten it out later. But just to sort of begin to straighten it out, so that proposed rulemaking, when it was published, was aligned with the current standard at that time, which was WCAG 2.1. However, shortly thereafter, WCAG was updated. So in October of that year, WCAG 2.2 became the W3C's recommended standard. And then in April 24th of last year, 2024, the DOJ's final rule was published. Now, as all that was going on, we were working on our agency policies and adjusting them as we went to align with that DOJ rule. And also that change in WCAG standards that happened, as well as there was an accompanying rule by the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, and that's noted here as well. That was finalized on May 9th of 2024. So we took all of that into account as we were working on those policies and finalizing them. So let's talk briefly a bit about those the new DOJ and HHS rules that I just mentioned. The DOJ rule.
Real quick, Adam, sorry. There is a question in the chat, and it might benefit people going forward. What is W3C?
The World Wide Web Consortium.
Okay, thank you.
Sure. I sort of glossed over that. My apologies. Um, yeah, so thanks for the question. The DOJ rule applies to all digital content produced by or for the state of Oregon. And so we should note that this also includes content that the state procures from vendors. The HHS rule, which is under Section 504, covers all entities that receive federal health care money. So that would apply to us specifically at Oregon Health Authority, as well as the CCOs and vendors that we contract with. To give you a little more detail about those rules, so as previously mentioned, these rules both set a technical conformance standard, and this is a big deal because for a long time it was unclear, at least with regard to states and counties and municipalities, what the technical conformance standard was, even though over the course of decades it has become clear that WCAG is the international standard, and in the last decade, the federal standard. Um, there, there was some clarity lacking as to what standard states and municipalities were expected to meet. So this is really important. The new rules, finally said clearly under the ADA, the standard for state and municipal governments is WCAG, 2.1 levels A and double A. As previously mentioned, between the time that the rule was proposed and finally published, WCAG was updated to WCAG 2.2. This has happened before and can create some confusion, but to try to clarify, the current standard of WCAG is WCAG 2.2, even though that rule written before that update states WCAG 2.1. The other important thing that these rules do is they create a 2-year timeline for states and municipalities. The compliance deadline, therefore, for the DOJ rule is April 24th, 2026. And these rules cover all sorts of digital content, websites, apps, digital data visualizations, social media posts. Importantly for us in state government, they also cover conventional electronic documents. And I say that's important because this state, like many states, produces many, many documents. A lot of our information is in document form. So it's important to point out that the rule also covers conventional electronic documents, and that includes portable document formats or PDFs, word processor file formats such as Word documents, presentation file formats such as PowerPoint presentations like this one, and spreadsheet file formats like Excel files. Okay, so we've mentioned WCAG, or the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, but if this is a new concept for you, we wanted to take a moment and just give you a little background. So when we talk about the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, or WCAG, one question that comes up is, well, how do you say that? So I'll say that I say WCAG, but you'll sometimes hear WCAG or WCAG. People say it in different ways. That's okay. You can choose how you want to pronounce it, but you'll hear me say WCAG today. It was developed by the World Wide Web Consortium, or W3C, as previously mentioned. It provides technology-neutral accessibility standards for digital content. Many countries around the world now reference WCAG as a technical standard for digital accessibility. It is, for example, the European Accessibility Act is aligned with WCAG. Canadian regulations, it's used in Japan, Australia, throughout the world. This has become the international standard. There are 4 iterative versions of WCAG. So WCAG 1.0, WCAG 2.0, 2.1, and now the most recent version, recommended version 2.2. And then within those versions, there are 3 conformance levels. So WCAG A, level A, level AA, and level AAA. Now, if you really want to nerd out about WCAG, we've got another slide here with a little more information. Um, so just to tell you a little more, WCAG 1.0, that was the first version of WCAG. That goes all the way back to 1999. So this is now a 26-year-old standard. That was superseded by WCAG 2.0 in 2008, by WCAG 2.1 in 2017, and then by WCAG 2.2 in 2023. Uh, it's important to note that all versions of WCAG 2, so basically all the versions since 2008, are additive and backward compatible. That is to say, um, if you meet, for example, WCAG 2.2, you also meet WCAG 2.1. So when we talk in a minute about our policies, which are aligned to WCAG 2.2, by meeting those policies, you are also meeting the federal rule, which is aligned to WCAG 2.1. Let's see what else. Oh, yes. So Section 508, which had previously been a somewhat independent standard, and in some ways not technically defined, was realigned with WCAG 2.0 in 2017. So at that point, WCAG became the federal standard. And as mentioned before, the DOJ and HHS rules are aligned with WCAG 2.1, but our policy aligns with WCAG 2.2, levels A and AA. So yeah, let's talk a little bit about our policies for Oregon Health Authority and ODHS. These are shared policies on digital accessibility. There are two of them. There is the Content Creation and Sharing Policy, or ODHS OHA 010-029. And then there's the Hardware, Software, and Systems Policy, or ODHS OHA 010-030. And there are links there. We'll make sure we share those with folks if you would like to peruse them at your leisure. They were developed by the Digital Accessibility Policy Work Group over the course of 2 years, and that work group included participants from OHA and ODHS, as well as representatives from DAS, Oregon Broadband, Oregon Commission for the Blind, and others. Let's talk for a moment just about each of those individual policies. We won't go into great depth, but we'll give you just a brief overview. So the first one, the Digital Accessibility and Content Creation and Sharing Policy. The purpose of this policy is to ensure that any form of digital content created by the agency and provided either internally or externally is accessible. And that digital content needs to adhere to the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines 2.2 levels A and AA, and this includes websites, reports, surveys, dashboards, and documents. The second policy we mentioned is the Digital Accessibility and Hardware, Software, and Systems Policy. And what this says, it has requirements for procuring or building ICT solutions in alignment with WCAG 2.2, levels A and AA. And to just give a little more detail there, Information and Communications Technology, or ICT solutions, describes information technology content, applications, and services. That includes all hardware and software, agency or third-party created multimedia and electronic content, and electronic hardware, software, and documents used by ODHS and OHA. Well, that brings us to the end of the first half of our presentation, and so with that, we're going to move on to how all of this affects project management. And so I will hand things over to Melissa to take us forward.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Adam. And I think maybe it would be a good idea just to pause really quickly and see if there are any questions about that first part of it before we jump into my part. Now, if your questions are about what does this have to do with project managers or vendors, or can I see this as an example? How have you used this in your work? We're going to talk about that stuff. But anything about policies or what WCAG is,
There was a checklist from Utah provided in the chat. Looks like Jennifer Godfrey is asking what you think of that checklist that was provided.
Yes, so Adam is going to talk a little bit about that because Adam is actually
Okay.
a member of a multi-state collaborative that is working on digital accessibility. So, Adam, will you talk a little bit about Utah and how other states handle this?
Oh, well, this appears to be, I'm just opening up the link. Yeah, this is
Yeah.
this is a WebAIM checklist. Um, yeah, WebAIM is a good consultancy that works in this field, and I will say that I've used WebAIM materials in the past, and they are good. So if this checklist helps you, then I think I don't I don't know that I've seen this precise one recently. I think they've updated it. Um, but it is likely good because this is a good company. One thing to note, though, if you go and search for in Google WCAG or WCAG 2 or WCAG 2.0 or WCAG 2.2, it is unfortunately likely that the first few Google hits you will get will be consultant and vendor sites like this one. So to get to the actual WCAG standard, you need to make sure that that's a W3C site. And that's not to say that those first few hits on Google might not be helpful, but we always want to go back to the original standard and refer to that. I hope that helps.
Thank you.
Yes, and
And
Adam,
just
will you
to
talk? Oh, go ahead,
just
please.
to add to that, sorry, Melissa. Andy Nunez Brewster did post in the chat that W3 C web page. So just FYI, it is in the chat.
Yeah, that's the organizational page. I will also share just a link in the chat to the standard. If you'll give me just 1 second. So here's the actual W3C WCAG 2.2 standard in all of its glory.
Perfect. Jordan also provided the link as well. Jordan Myers.
Oh, great.
So looks like they're both the same link. Thanks so much.
Oh, great. Yeah.
And Jennifer is just interested in whether or not there's a checklist provided in those resources.
Of a sort.
The checklists are deceptive.
Well, so what the W3C provides are success criteria. There are not failure criteria provided there. And if that distinction is lost to you, that's okay. We do have a methodology that we've prepared internally that has failure criteria. It's an iterative methodology document. It does run into the several hundreds of pages, but we are working on making that more widely available. And so that's something that if you're interested in, reach out to us. Depending on where you're at with applying WCAG, that might or might not be helpful to you, but just so that you know that is something that exists.
Tiffany, your hands up.
Yes, I do have one question for you, Adam. In the slide that you talked about how people have to comply at a certain date or by a certain date. Anyway, one part of that is like, I guess my question is clarifying. So do people, based on the rules now, have to comply like with starting anything new and posting it or providing it to the public or whatnot? Does it have to be compliant now? And then is that future date that agencies or whatnot have to comply, does that apply to retro stuff, if that makes sense?
Yeah, that's a good question. I will try to provide an answer in, let's say, I'll try for 3 minutes, and cut me off if I go longer. So written into the DOJ rule and HHS rules are certain exceptions. And let's bookmark that and we'll come back to it, but there are exceptions. Now, in essence, what those federal rules are telling us is that at the end of that deadline, or when that deadline comes up, so that would be April 24th, 2026, for the DOJ rule, and then the HHS rule is a couple weeks after that, so I think May 9th, 2026. At that date, all content produced after that date needs to meet the WCAG standard. So maybe that answers the first part of your question. So what one of the main things that we need to be paying attention to between now and that deadline is putting in place processes so that when that deadline arrives, all the new content that we're pushing out from that date forward is accessible, meets the standard. We're not quite there yet. We are trying to create the structures and the processes that we will need to do that, and it's going to take work to get there. But I think we're moving in a positive direction. So there's that. And then there's the question of exceptions. So there are exceptions in the rules and in our policies. A couple that are important. So there's an exception for archived content. And I'm going to try to paraphrase from memory what that exception states. But in essence, it is telling us that content created before that deadline that I mentioned in 2026 that is placed into a demarcated archive section of a website or archive database. Does not have to meet the rule as long as it is clearly demarcated as such, and as long as it is not content that is currently used by the public to gain information, apply for, or participate in services provided by that state agency. So, at the beginning of that description of that exception, you might have been like, oh, that's a lot of stuff. And then when you get to the end of it, it's like, well, but that's a pretty big caveat. So what that's telling us is by that deadline, all the content that we're putting out from that date forward needs to be accessible. And also, probably a lot of the content that we're producing now will also ultimately need to be accessible, because if it's still in use by the public at that date, it will need to be accessible at that date. Now there's a little that gives us a little wiggle room because we have between now and that date. So if things that we produce aren't perfect right now, we still have time to fix them. But the more inaccessible content that doesn't meet the standards that we push out now, the more of a task we will have to fix it as we come closer to that deadline. So really, as much as possible, now we should be doing our best to endeavor to put out accessible content, keeping that deadline in mind. There are other exceptions in the rules. There's one for pre-existing conventional documents, which is slightly more broad than that archived content exception, and that is to say conventional electronic documents produced before that date are also accepted and don't have to be placed in a specific archiving area. And I think that's just an admission by DOJ that state governments have loads and loads of documents, and we may not be able to get them all into archives by the time that date comes around. And so they are accepted as long as, once again, they are not in use by the public to gain information, apply for, or participate in services. Another important question that I think this may touch on is, okay, well, are we talking about public-facing content or are we talking about internal-facing content? Well, our policies don't distinguish. So if you're asking, well, does this content need to be accessible? Does it matter if it's public-facing or internal-facing? Well, ultimately, everything that we produce should be accessible. we're taking a more systematic approach to public-facing content because that falls under those rules under the ADA in Section 504. But we know, um, you know, members of our policy writing group, folks that we've talked to, people with disabilities who work for the state, that there are barriers to employment and there are barriers to promotion that exist for people with disabilities within the state workforce. And that also falls under the ADA, under Title I. So that is something else that we need to fix. So as we become aware of those things, those are also things that we want to fix with our content production. So I may have actually added to your question, but I hope that answers the question. Was there anything else before we move on to project management?
That's great, Adam. Thank you. There is one more question in the chat, basically asking about your previous slides and would like some clarification on what A, AA, AAA, that those designations mean.
Yeah, so typically the way this works is that A and AA are often used as the legal benchmarks. That's how it's done in other countries, in the European Accessibility Act, under federal law. After the Section 508 refresh, they cite A and AA as the standard for legal compliance. And then also these federal rules under the ADA and Section 504 and our policy. So that's typically how it's played out. Levels A and AA are the requirements that are legal conformance requirements. And if you go through them, the level A standards tend to be more basic and more significant barriers. The AA standards tend to be sometimes more technical fixes and may sort of shade into the usability of accessibility. The AAA standards, so the AAA requirements, there are AAA requirements in WCAG, and those are, I think, you can think of them as best practice. It is helpful to know them and to refer to them because they can guide decision making and make your product even more accessible. Although the W3C says, and a lot of practitioners will tell you, it can be difficult or impossible to meet all of the AAA standards. Some of them may contradict one another. Some of them, such as the enhanced minimum color contrast thresholds under AAA, are actually really hard to meet. If you're doing a data visualization, it's just hard to find colors that meet a 7:1 color minimum color contrast. So we're basically, the law doesn't insist, and we don't insist that you try to meet AAA standards. We're using A and AA as the standard for conformance. But if you want to treat some of those AAA standards as best practice, that's certainly, in some cases, advisable.
There are other questions in the chat, but for the interest of time, we're going to go ahead and move on to the next section of the presentation, and either we'll address the questions at the end of the presentation or ask Adam and the others to respond by email.
Sounds good.
Thank you.
All right, Adam, will you please go to the next slide? All right, so Jordan, we are so going to answer your question in here. Digital accessibility and project management principles. The foundation of this is shift left strategy. This is something that you will hear about in software design, in business strategy, and in risk management. It is the practice of identifying and addressing your potential risks as early as possible in a project or a process. Basically moving your risk assessment and mitigation activities to the left, in front, in Earth time, linear on the left. Time of the development life cycle, allowing for earlier intervention and better control over potential issues. Next slide, please. This is super important because we need to identify and mitigate these risks during the planning phase instead of waiting to discover them while we are in the process of doing our project. And that especially applies to big public-facing technology projects. It helps to do proactive identification of your digital accessibility requirements, proactively planning for risks coming up and having mitigation on hand, and then having written resolution on hand, plans to resolve these things when they come up, because they do. And then proactive quality testing in the design process. All of these things are really important to think about as part of your project and how digital accessibility is going to fit into your risk plan. Next slide, please. The benefits of this approach for us in terms of state government, it's all about efficiency, right? Doing it efficiently, doing it at lower cost, doing it right the first time. When we think about digital accessibility in front of our project, we get a better quality of public-facing products and services that are accessible to everybody out of the gate. This is something that most technology projects do not do right now. And so when they are released to the public and the public goes to use them, somebody who uses a screen reader, for example, probably won't be able to use it at all or as effectively as somebody who is a sighted user of that software. There are reduced costs. When we do it right the first time and consider digital accessibility in our projects, we don't have to remediate them later. And trust me, from experience as a project manager, you don't want to pay a whole lot of money to somebody to fix a broken product once you find out that it is broken. Informed and enhanced decision making. Also from my experience, when you think about these things at the front of your projects, they really help guide the decision making towards being more customer friendly and customer focused. It improves your communications and your relationships with folks. And it increases your stakeholder confidence when you acknowledge that these things are going to happen and show them a plan for it. Also, your stakeholders themselves may have digital accessibility needs and they like to be included. Significantly reduced risk of lawsuits. Okay, so I'm speeding through to get to this good part because this is really the part that I need you to know about as government employees. During COVID, the risk of lawsuits against companies, governments, pretty much anyone who was doing a public-facing digital thing related to COVID stuff, they started getting sued. And those lawsuits are expensive and they almost always succeed. I know that there was one against Rite Aid that was settled for millions of dollars. Adam, can you name off some other ones that we talked about when we were writing our policy?
Oh, yeah, significantly, speaking of COVID, both New York State and the state of my home state of Oklahoma both had to settle with federal DOJ for, in the case of New York State, an inaccessible COVID website. In the case of Oklahoma, an inaccessible Medicaid app. There was also a case recently, I think that's important and relevant in California. The state of California was sued for an inaccessible parks website for $2 million, and the plaintiffs won that case. So on I think a project that was maybe $20 million, then the state had to pay an additional $2 million for having published an inaccessible web page. So, you know, uh, that's a thing that we want to avoid. Absolutely.
And at the end, we're going to talk about how that came to our attention and why we are telling you this golden information at the beginning of your projects. Oh my gosh. Faster time to development. It avoids delays caused by downstream risks. I know the pain of having a technology project that's about to go statewide and then having to delay it because you have to go back and fix it to make sure that everybody has access. And if you consider it ahead of time, you can build it into your process and make sure that you're talking to your shareholders about it. I'm sorry, talking to your shareholders about it, and also the people who are going to be the end users of your product to make sure that you're meeting quality assurance testing and that they are sharing their needs from the thing that you're producing with you. Next slide, please. Okay, so digital accessibility in your projects. It applies to products. It applies to your individual project team needs. It applies to your shareholders. It applies to your communications. It applies to your vendors. Very important here. We'll talk about that in a moment. your end users, and your project documentation. In government, when we do things, as Adam had mentioned, the documents are often there and archived, but as we have project artifacts, we need to make sure that those are accessible to folks when we archive them in our project close phase. There's a significant gain here from universal design principles and the process efficiencies. Basically, when you design things based on digital accessibility, they work better for everyone. So there are very, very few places where it's going to conflict with people who don't have disabilities using products. Also, the process efficiencies, when you design with digital accessibility up front, it just improves the process for everyone throughout. And then the considerable risk of lawsuit exposure for government agencies if our public-facing products are not accessible. Next slide, please.
Yeah, and do you mind if I butt in for this one?
You can go ahead and take this one.
Okay, I moved a bunch of stuff around and I didn't want to confuse you. So yeah, we wanted to talk in that context briefly about an important concept that you should be aware of, and this is a document known as a VPAT, or Voluntary Product Accessibility Template. This is a form that helps buyers assess how a product, typo, such as software, hardware, electronic content, and support documentation meets accessibility standards. Suppliers can use it to document how their product or service conforms to accessibility standards for information and communication technology, and it can help government buyers to assess ICT for accessibility when doing market research and evaluating proposals. Now, there are various templates for VPATs that exist. There are templates for Section 508, WCAG 2.1, and I should say the Section 508 actually also, because Section 508 now aligns with WCAG 2.0, that's actually a Section 508 and WCAG 2.0 template. Then there's the WCAG 2.1 template, and then there's a both Section 508 and WCAG 2.1 template. I know that's probably confusing. If you have a choice as to which one you want to use or request, the WCAG 2.1 template shows best, I think most clearly, that you are in conformance with those federal rules under the ADA and agency policy. So unless you have a separate agency policy or program policy that requires you to have specific documentation related to Section 508, and remember, WCAG is, or Section 508 is now aligned with WCAG, so that's not really necessary, but if you need to do it to check a box, you can get that Section 508 and WCAG 2.1 template. But in most cases, just the WCAG 2.1 template is going to be fine. Another note here, just to familiarize you with the lingo, a completed VPAT is called an ACR, or Accessibility Conformance Report. So you will see both terms thrown around sometimes, sometimes incorrectly, sometimes interchangeably, but sometimes a VPAT will be referred to as an ACR. And then finally, I just want to note the information in the VPAT unfortunately may not be correct and should be verified through a robust, accessible procurement process. But requesting and receiving a VPAT or ACR for a product is an excellent starting point for ensuring digital accessibility. And with that, I'll hand back to Melissa.
Ooh. All right, next slide, please. Okay, so during the define and plan stage of your projects, you're going to want to ask, is the product or service public facing? Does it need to be WCAG conformant? Is it digital? Are you going to be putting it up on the internet for folks to get? Do your internal project artifacts need to be accessible for your team? Do your communications methods need to be adjusted to meet the needs of your team? For example, we find, unfortunately, that Teams is not always the most accessible platform for meetings. Sometimes we have folks asked to use Zoom because it meets accessibility needs better. And then making sure in your communications, you're also getting things like ASL interpreters. That's something that we use a lot in our work that helps meet your team's needs. Is digital accessibility entered into your risk register? Do you have a plan for your vendors, and do you need a VPAT? The key to this is telling your vendor that you are going to do this upfront. If you are clear with them from the starting gate that you need this to happen and that you are going to be meeting federal law, it will not surprise them. And trust me, they will try to act sometimes like this is a surprise to them. So make this an expectation upfront and enforce it throughout your project, because that is a big CYA in terms of risk management here. Next slide, please. During the do stage of your project, when you're doing your project, refer back to your planning documents and your product requirements. That's where the VPAT really comes in handy here, because when you have your product and you are asking the vendor if they met those criteria, that is going to kind of be your checklist. You're going to monitor and update your risk register as these things change, because you're going to need to keep track of how you address things that came up. Actively manage digital accessibility risks that become issues. It is always a good idea to at least slow down, if not stop, and address those things, because they will come back to get you in the end. When in doubt, quality test things. And I don't mean with automatic testing, even though that can be a good way to get started, but quality test products with people to make sure that they are accessible. We have a methodology about that, and we're incorporating that into how we do our work. So we're always happy to come back and talk to you more about testing. Prioritizing your customer and your end user feedback, and being willing to adjust your timeline and deliverable to really meet their needs. It's all about making sure that we're meeting the needs of our customers. Next slide, please. During the close stage, make sure that you are addressing digital accessibility and quality testing and reporting. Included in your lessons learned and best practices, because the next team that comes after you, that sometimes is going to be you and your team, are going to take that forward and do better next time, just like we did. Document accessibility fixes and bugs with your vendors, because on that project, when you do amendments to your contract, you're going to want to make sure that they bring all of those things forward into product iterations in the future, but also that they're not going to repeat them in products that you contract separately. And your digital product should ultimately have a VPAT on file and that ACR, because that is what you have in your contract file that shows that you did this as part of your project. Okay, next slide, please. Yay, okay. I'm so sorry we're at this part at the end, but we learned most of this when we put up Get Vaccinated Oregon, and we really rapidly made project management and software development adjustments with my electronic vaccine card that went so much better. Get Vaccinated Oregon, when we started that project, that was actually how Adam started working with us as a contractor. Get Vaccinated Oregon was Google software that we were handed with a team that managed it. And because of the way it was set up, it wasn't accessible from the starting gate. And so we had to put up, this registry of everywhere that was offering vaccine, and put it on a map and make it accessible to everyone in Oregon so they could go search for vaccines near their house. And it was not accessible. So we had to stop, and we had to bring on our wonderful Adam and the testing folks that Adam brought with him. And we made Get Vaccinated Oregon as accessible as we possibly could. But more importantly, we learned what to do better next time, so that when it came time to do the vaccine records website, the digital vaccine card, so that if people lost their card, they could print out the thing or have it on their phone. We applied everything that we learned in terms of project management. And we you don't hear a lot about this project because it went so well. We tested with folks. Things were accessible from the start. We stopped and we changed the name of the system itself, because the old name of it was something like one of the immigration databases, and people wouldn't use it because it was associated with that other thing. And so we stopped and we changed the name of it and retested it, and it tested better. So, Adam, will you please also share from your perspective what the more important parts of that were?
Oh, well, yeah. I mean, I think you've touched on those are the most important points. Get Vaccinated Oregon, right, was not accessibility was kind of retrofitted on later. And you can do that, but the lesson of that project and so many other projects is that when you do that, it takes more time and it is much more expensive. It is much cheaper and much more efficient to integrate accessibility from the earliest stages possible. And so with my electronic vaccine card, from the very earliest discussions, we were talking about digital accessibility in the context of requirements. I think even before we had adapted the app, and did it come from I'm forgetting. Was it from
It came
Washington? It was
from,
from
I think
Washington.
it came from Washington, it came from some other states. And then when we made our digital accessibility improvements through our implementation, we pushed that back out to them to improve theirs.
That's right. Yeah, they had given us the app. We requested their version of the app. We tested it before we even started building ours. So we had a list of things that we were, trying to remediate from the very beginning. And then, as Melissa said, when we completed it, we completed an ACR, and we handed that code back with some guidance to Washington to improve their iteration of that app. There's much more we could say about that. We could go on and on, but
It was so successful that we formed a work group and wrote some policies and created
there you
a
go.
couple of positions for it.
Right.
So that's how really important it is to do this, and how critical it is to build this work and this knowledge base within state government and within our agencies, because this is a change in the way that we do things that's beneficial really for everyone. Um, Adam, do you have any other part? Oh, and don't get sued. That's my other parting thought. Do your risk management. Please don't get sued.
That's right.
And we
No, go
at
ahead. Sorry.
OHA and ODHS are rolling out the implementation of our policies. We talk to some of the state level groups too, and so I'm sure you're going to see and hear a lot more from us going forward. And of course, we're always here as a resource if you have questions, and we're happy to come back and talk to you more in detail.
Okay, it looks like we do have time to go back to the earlier questions. The first question was, what is the definition of public?
Just stop sharing. Okay. What is the definition of public? That feels like a trick question.
So it was in regard to the public-facing websites
So
versus
in
the internal.
the
Go ahead.
federal rule defines it a certain way for certain jurisdictions. So I think it's based on the entity. So Adam, will you talk a little bit about the different population levels and the different public entities that have to do this and how it's defined there?
Well, that relates to the timelines, and then so that the number of members of the public served. So for smaller entities, there's actually a 3-year implementation timeline. That doesn't apply to states. States are large enough that we have a 2-year implementation timeline.
Yeah, but your school districts and your city governments will be doing things like this.
Mhm. Um, well, I would say members of the public are people who use the information or services that we provide as agencies, as opposed to employees of the state who create those materials or use them as part of an internal function. And I think I saw a sub question there.
So for example, when we're working on CCO 3.0 procurement at OHA, and we are going to be considering how digital accessibility is part of that throughout. Because when we did CCO 2.0, we put up a big public-facing website because the public needs to engage with that procurement. And so this time around, all of that's going to need to be digitally accessible.
And Sarah Stone with DAS Procurement Services mentioned that this is something State Procurement Services will be working on with the Oregon Department of Justice to include the guidelines in the procurement documents.
That is really fantastic to hear.
Okay. A lot of reiteration that it should be included in the RF request for procurement process. If you're subscribing to software platforms, now's the time to put pressure on your vendors.
And I will add that as we've been talking about this over the last few years, some of the feedback that we've gotten is that vendors aren't going to do this. And I know we're going to get pushback about it, but at OEDHS and OHA at least, it is a line we're going to hold that things need to be digitally accessible.
Okay. Christine Shook asked, would you recommend completing a VPAT for your own internal application, or is there another method for internal apps?
So I would say you can. It's not a bad idea, and we've done it. It can be helpful. I mean, I think we're ultimately going to need to work out what is our process of documentation internally. But a VPAT is a universally recognized, or ACR is a universally recognized form of documenting accessibility. So I think you absolutely can do that. I mean, you'll need someone who has some experience with manual accessibility testing to kind of lead that. But if you have someone to do that testing, then I think that's a good idea.
Thank you. Kimberly Johnson said that she writes procedures and also works with older documents. The audience for these is internal staff, but some of these documents are also subject to public records requests. The agency already won't migrate all of our microfiche documents to digital format until and unless a request we requested, it says. I'm not sure our current digital format for digitizing images of typed, mimeographed, carbon copied, etc. would be usable by any of the accessible software. Is this something that we must convert now, or can we maintain the option to do it upon request?
Um, well, I want to be careful in answering that. I am not, none of us are a lawyer. So that's a big caveat. Firstly, but and I may not understand all, just based on your reading of that question, I may not understand, or we may not understand all of the complexities of the question. But if it's something that's not going to be used by the public until such time as it is requested, then it's not a high priority item for remediation. Um, Now, I want to be careful though in saying that, because sometimes the question has come up, well, we might need to remediate it now, but then we put it into archiving later, and we're going to save it in a format like a TIFF format. Um, and is that okay? And my answer to that would be, well, not really, because if you've gone to the effort and expense of making something accessible, and then you save it with the expectation that, oh, probably nobody will request this, and then somebody requests it, and then you have to make it accessible again, that's ultimately a waste of effort. So um, that's just kind of a that's,
Okay.
that's just kind of a coda to that question. But I would say, anything that is already accessible, we should do our best to maintain that accessibility as it passes from one format to
Mhm.
another. But if it's in physical media right now, um, you're right that that's not a format that many users of assistive technology will be able to access. It would need to be converted to something else. Um, my preference would be HTML. We do have an HTML preferred uh, clause as a part of our policies. Um, and we didn't talk about that at all, but we can talk about it more if we need to. But if not HTML, then an accessible document format, such as an accessible PDF or a mediated PDF, something like that.
Thank you, Adam. We'll go ahead and move on. So Kimberly Johnson equates materials available on the internet are public, and materials available on the intranet are internal.
Mhm. Yeah.
So that's how she's delineating it. Okay, I will go over the, oops, sorry, my screen is jumping on me. We'll be providing information on where you can access the recordings late in a few moments here. Valdivia asks, are the WCAG guidelines covered within Section 508? And thanking you for this information.
Yeah, I'll try to answer that. So Section 508 was its own functional standard that existed for a number of years parallel to WCAG, although over time it came to resemble WCAG in many ways pretty closely. And then in 2017, the Access Board just made the decision to, okay, we're going to just, Section 508 is now WCAG. They are like, if you meet WCAG 2.0, you also meet Section 508. So that was called the Section 508 refresh. The reason we still, like, for example, the reason that there still exists a Section 508 version of the VPAT is, well, complex, but some agencies, programs may still have on the books, we need to prove Section 508 conformance. We don't care about this WCAG thing. We need to prove, so there has to be a template to meet that need. If you know accessibility, you know that at this point, in essence, they are the same thing. But that's why Section 508 is, I mean, Section 508 is its own law. I'm not saying that it does not exist. It does exist, but by meeting WCAG now, you meet Section 508, WCAG 2.0. But of course, WCAG has continued to evolve, and now the new federal rules are referencing a newer version of WCAG, and so on.
Oh, thank you. Timothy Keeley has a comment. I'm not sure if there's a question in here. Department of Corrections has issues with security concerns between what we provide to the public and what is also available to the AICs. I'm not sure what AICs are, adults in custody, sorry. So is that just stating what their guidelines are?
A lot of our documents are available by request to the AICs for legal purposes. So anything that we publish, we have to provide to the AICs if they request them for legal purposes. So anything that we send out that is available to the public, the AICs are also capable of having. So anything that we make for public access, we also have to make in access for the AICs, which means that we're having to create two forms of the documents. One that we can give to the AICs, one that we can give out to the public, because we cannot give them access to the internet.
Okay, that sounds like a complex
Yeah.
problem with a lot of legal kind of murkiness around it. I would hesitate to give an answer, but Christine, did you want to say something?
Oh, well, I think I'm going there. So this, all of what we shared today and the rules that we shared today don't dictate what is public or what is not public, but that if it is public, it needs to meet these certain standards of accessibility. So I just wanted to make sure that we were clear on that delineation. And so what you do make public would then be accessible. And I don't know that it would dictate what format you then share to the AICs. I don't really know like the tools that you use on that side of things. But we're not saying what to
Well,
make public. We're just saying if it's public, it must meet
well,
these
anything that we make
standards.
public, we also have to be able to get to them.
Correct.
And that's where it becomes sort of a problem for us that we're running into. A lot of these requirements that we're running into with how I create a lot of our forms, and we're moving them to digital format. And we're trying to figure out how to accommodate that where a lot of the AICs or the adults in custodies, um, we have to still provide them in paper form for them, and how to translate that between paper and digital. And so we're running into issues now with accommodating, because we're also running into issues with ADA compliance issues now as well, because of we're having our population is aging. Our population is running into a lot of issues with um, we cannot provide digital. We do not have the equipment to provide enough for that. It would be cost prohibitive. It would also be a security concern. They do have tablets, but not enough to give out for every AIC. And so because of that, it would be a problem. They do have access to limited amounts of digital, but we don't have enough. And so to only give it to them in digital would mean that we'd be restricting access to a vast majority of the AICs. And so that's kind of where we're running into is we're trying to move digital and to give access and broaden the accessibilities, but we're kind of in sort of this bind of restriction on terms of security restrictions by federal and state standards, but also restrictions in terms of following ADA standards.
Yeah, well, that's a thorny problem. I would say that, if you have tablets available, that's good. So folks who are blind, have low vision, visual processing disorders, um, depending on what's available, some mobility disabilities could use that tablet to interact with something like a form if the form is accessible.
We do
And
have
that's
translators.
okay. Yeah, I mean that is another um, approach. I mean, the methodology, the thinking behind digital accessibility is that um, we want everybody to be able to access information and interact with services and products independently. Um, and that includes people with and without disabilities. Um, in an incarceration setting, the question of independence is different, I would imagine. Although, a right to be an independent individual, I think probably transcends uh, incarcerated status to some extent as well. Um, but I don't know. That's a thorny that's a thorny problem. Those would be my answers. But if you have tablets available, that would be one way for people to fill out a form if the form is accessible. If it's an iPad, for example, it will have voiceover built in. You can use gesture commands to navigate with voiceover, so a blind person could navigate that form, fill it out on their own, answer any confidential questions on their own without having to go through another person, um, uh, etc. They could use magnification if they needed to. They could use gesture commands to navigate if there was, for certain mobility disabilities. So yeah, in that case, you would want accessible forms to be available in that format. And for other users, paper-based forms might be the best approach. Having multi-modalities is, I think, always a good thing.
Hey, Adam, kind of adding on to that, might you suggest um, would a good resource for that question be the Oregon Public Records Advocate? They might be able to look at that from the public perspective and give some solid advice, perhaps. I know I've worked with them in the past.
There's also a number of questions or comments regarding records retention, how old records are within each agency. I don't think we're going to go ahead and get into that at this time, but I would suggest that folks take the questions up through their chain of command and get those answered as appropriate for their different agencies.
Yep. At OHA ODHS, we are working really closely with our records retention and
Great.
management folks to figure that part.
Perfect. Thank you
Yeah,
so much.
I was going to chime in to say that's a really great place to start because that helps you know in the end what documents exist, what's remaining, and then what do we need to make accessible. So that's a really brilliant location to start kind of assessing where you're at with what I joke about, your pile of PDFs, if they are PDFs.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate all of your participation in this presentation. I'm going to go ahead and get started with closing the meeting. We hope that you enjoyed this presentation. Thank you all for attending, and thank you, Adam, Melissa, and Christine for presenting. I've posted a link to a short survey in the chat that will help us improve future PMUG experiences and to nominate yourself or a colleague as a future speaker. You can look for a follow-up email with links to resources a week or so after this presentation. Also, please share with your team members and those who may not be on the PMUG listserv or are interested in becoming a PMUG planning team member to reach out to myself, Amy Croucher. Again, if you'd like to become a member of the OPMAB, visit the OPMAB website provided earlier in the chat, and also visit the BANG website if you're interested in the Business Analyst Networking Group. Enjoy the rest of your week, and PMUG will convene again in March. Thank you so much, everyone. Bye.
Thank you.